Tomorrow is April 1st, which is April Fool's Day. And about once a month, we come around to a psalm. And so I figured, given tomorrow being April Fool's Day and Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 being about the fool, that we would look at Psalm 14 and Psalm 53. It doesn't fall exactly on April Fool's Day, but we're one day away from it. And there is certainly good material for you and I to learn. In fact, the fool is we'll see that as we go on. It's not as evident who the fool here is as we might suppose. But let's go ahead. We'll read Psalm 14, and then we'll go ahead and comment on the two Psalms for a bit this morning. Psalm 14 it says, "To the chief musician, a psalm of David. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek God. They have all turned aside. They have together become corrupt. There is none who does good, no, not one. Have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call on the Lord? There they are in great fear, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You shame the counsel of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord brings back the captivity of his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad." So that was Psalm 14. Now, if you were looking at Psalm 53, you would notice that they are almost exactly alike, these two Psalms. Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are very much similar. There are just a few differences. And we might wonder, well, why are there differences between these two Psalms? The differences primarily show up down at verse 4 through 7. There are a few reasons why there might be some differences. It might be that the original writer intentionally made some changes in the second version of the psalm. Psalm 14 focuses on God's comfort of his people in this situation that they find themselves in, whereas Psalm 53 focuses more on the judgment of the wicked. And so again, down in verse 4, 5, 6, in that range, we see that difference. Perhaps there was a secondary writer who reworked the original psalm to fit the specific circumstances of their region or their time. Or it is possible, though I suspect much less likely, that there were textual variances that came in due to copyist errors and so forth. I think the first two explanations likely make a whole lot more sense than the third one does. Now, as I read it, I read the notation at the beginning, which is typically actually part of the Psalms, to the chief musician, a psalm of David. And on that basis, some might conclude, well, okay, this was a psalm written by David, which is possible, though I think there are things in the psalm that tell us that it's not likely by David. The Hebrew text just simply says David, which is sometimes understood not to mean an attribution to David, but rather in the style of David, so far as the nature of the psalm. There are some other psalms that definitely have the same style as David in writing, but are evident that David was not the writer of them. That is quite likely the case. Commentators and scholars, they're not 100% agreed on it, but many do lean towards this being after the time of David and dealing with things after his time. Primarily during the time of the captivity in Babylon, which, again, I think the psalm itself somewhat bears that out, that this is a captivity psalm. But we'll see that as we study through today, that it may fit into that time frame. All right, well, let's get into the words of the psalm. So Psalm 14 and verse 1, or 53 and verse 1 if you want to follow along from 53, because it will be worded very much the same. The fool has said in his heart that there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none who does good. Now, of course, denying the existence of God is a foolish and corrupt thing to do, and it will lead to abominable works and iniquity and so forth. The word fool that we have here is from the Hebrew word nebal. It means to be stupid, wicked, foolish, or a vile person. Maybe you remember a man in Scripture who wore the name Nabal. First Samuel chapter 25, Nabal was the husband of Abigail. And he was indeed a fool. He lived up to his name. We can maybe look more into Nabal on another occasion from 1 Samuel chapter 25. But go ahead and read that, and you will see a fool in action. Now, he didn't deny the existence of God, but he certainly did not honor David as he ought to, and there's other things concerning him. But the fool has proclaimed, as the psalmist tells us, that there is no God. The fool has taken a stupid, a wicked, a vile position to reject the Creator. Now, it's important to note that this denial of God is actually a heart issue. The fool has said in his heart that there is no God. The heart is sort of important. Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 23 tells us the heart of fools proclaims foolishness. Well, here is the evidence of the heart of a fool proclaiming foolishness, denying God. In 18 and verse 2, Proverbs 18 verse 2, a fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart. The proverb writer would also tell us that of the heart stems the issues of life, and if the fool doesn't have his life together and isn't focused on the right things, he will say things and do things that are certainly considered to be babble and dribble. And that is the case here. The fool has said, there is no God. However, when the wise king, when Solomon was talking about the fool and the fool's words, and he has a lot to say in Proverbs about the fool and about how foolish the words of a fool are, he also speaks about their actions. And over, what Solomon acknowledges about the actions of the fool is that they're wicked, they're absurd, they're nonsense. They just don't make sense if we were willing to understand that there is a God and that we are accountable before that God. He talks about the complacency of fools, how they waste their time, they don't do what they ought to do. He talks about the quarreling nature of a fool, that a fool is always ready for a fight. How they are perverse and they devise wicked plans and so forth. The psalmist here tells us of this fool who has rejected God in his mind, that he does corrupt things. They are corrupt. This word corrupt from Strong's, it's to decay, to cause ruin, to cast off, to corrupt, destroy, to lose, to mar, perish, spill, spoiler, or waste. There's nothing good in that. Nothing good whatsoever, nothing wholesome, nothing enduring, nothing that would give glory to the Creator at all in the activity of the fool. And here's the thing, if the heart is corrupt, then it should be no surprise that the words and the deeds would be corrupt as well. And so the author's point here is not this, that every word and every work of the fool is necessarily corrupt, but that is their manner of life. You know, they might say hi to somebody. They might help somebody across the street. They might, give flowers to their mother and, things like that. They might do some good things, but the course of their life is that they do things that will not glorify God. And so as a result, they do nothing that is useful eternally for their own soul. Let me add this in, that we should not limit the scope of this text to the atheist, to the person who adamantly will declare that there is no God, because I think the application of the text goes well beyond that. There are some who will actually claim the existence of God, and yet they will deny God in the way that they talk and in the way that they act. And so despite the fact that they'll acknowledge, sure, there is a God, they don't live that way. And that makes them fools as well. Remember in Hebrews chapter 3, the writer there is talking about the Exodus generation. And in Hebrews 3 at verse 10, they always go astray in their heart and they have not known my ways. Does that not sound like the fool? That's what that generation was doing. They were playing the fool. In verse 12 of the recipients of the letter, there was this warning that they should be careful lest there should be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. An evil heart of unbelief. We're talking about people who actually acknowledge that God exists, and that he says you can go into unbelief. Verse 18 and 19 of the Exodus generation, he says, to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who did not obey? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. He's dealing with the Exodus generation. If we were able to interview anybody in the Exodus generation and ask them, do you believe that God exists? Their answer would be yes. They believed that God existed. But in their words and in their works, they denied God. And so when we talk about the fool, yes, the one who just outright declares there is no God, absolute fool. But there's others who join along, who they won't say the statement, but they certainly live life as though there is no God. And so I want to add that in because part of the application of this text, I think, deals with a portion of God's people who were in that position, who they were just like the fool because the way they conducted themselves was as though there was no God. All right, verse 2. Verse 2 tells us that God looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek God. And so as the follow-up to verse 1, which acknowledges, there are fools and there are people who are in destructive speech and destructive ways. Well, God wants to know, is there somebody? Is there anybody? God looks down upon humanity to see if there are any who are willing to acknowledge him. The fool does not understand and does not seek the way of the Lord. And they're not going to walk upright and circumspect, but God's looking to see, is there anybody that will? Is there anybody that has concern and care for the ways of God? And as God looks down, what does he see? Well, as you keep going through the text, not very good things. Later on, he's going to acknowledge that there are some righteous ones, but primarily what he sees when he looks down is foolishness. People who are not willing to turn to God, not willing to understand. Verse 2 reminds me of a text out of Luke chapter 18. Verse 8 is the particular verse. And what we have is Jesus saying this, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? It's like Jesus is looking down at the earth and wondering, am I really going to find any faith when I return? Are there actually going to be people who believe in God, who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, who believe that God's way is right, and who therefore conduct themselves according to God's way? When the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? And what does he see when he looks down at you and I? Because when God looks down, he wants to see you and I understanding that he is true and that his will is true. He wants to see us seeking him. He wants to see us displaying faith. God looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, if there are any who are seeking God. Verse 3, every one of them has turned aside. They have together become corrupt. There is none who does good, no, not one. That's what he sees. As the Lord looked down upon the earth, what he saw was corruption. Now, unfortunately, 14 in verse 3 and 53 in verse 3 are texts that have been misused by Calvinists as a proof text for total hereditary depravity, the teaching that we're born in sin. That's not what these verses are teaching. In fact, they teach the exact opposite. Because notice the wording of it. Every one of them has turned aside. Well, if you were wicked when you were born, how did you turn aside to become wicked? Does it not imply that they were actually on board with God and then they turned away from God? Every one of them has turned aside. They have changed their direction to wickedness. Again, they have together become corrupt. He doesn't say that they were that way already. He says that they became that way. There are some decisions involved here. There are some choices that they have made that lead to the corruption that they find themselves in. And so Psalm 14:3 and 53:3 do not teach that we're born in sin. They teach the exact opposite, that people turn to sin, that people are good, are righteous, are pure, but they will turn aside. They will become corrupt. I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson that some, in fact, several commentators believe that this psalm is about the captivity, the Babylonian captivity. And I tend to agree with those who have come to that conclusion. In verse 3, consider verse 3 in light of a captivity text. And so Daniel chapter 9, Daniel, of course, was in the captivity. He was there in Babylon. And let's just go over there and look at Daniel 9, starting at verse 4. And what Daniel is considering as we're here in Daniel 9 is that the time they were supposed to be in captivity is coming to a close, and the return from the captivity is on the horizon, and they're not ready. As a people, they are not ready to return. Daniel chapter 9, and starting at verse 4, he says, let me get into the text here, starting at verse 4, and I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession and said, O Lord, great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant and mercy with those who love him and with those who keep his commandments, we have sinned and committed iniquity. We have done wickedly and rebelled, even by departing from your precepts and your judgments. Neither have we heeded your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings and our princes, to our fathers, and all the people of the land. O Lord, righteousness belongs to you, but to us shame of face, as it is this day. To the men of Judah, to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and all Israel, those near and those far off, and all the countries to which you have driven them, because of the unfaithfulness which they have committed against you. O Lord, to us belongs shame of face, to our kings, our princes, our fathers, because we have sinned against you. To the Lord our God belong mercy and forgiveness, though we have rebelled against him. We have not obeyed the voice of the Lord our God, to walk in his ways, which he set before us by his servants, the prophets. Yes, all Israel has transgressed your law and has departed so as not to obey your voice. Therefore, the curse and the oath written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, has been poured out on us because we have sinned against him. And he has confirmed his words, which he spoke against us and against our judges who judged us, by bringing upon us a great disaster. For under the whole heaven, such has never been done as what has been done to Jerusalem. As it is written in the law of Moses, all this disaster has come upon us, yet we have not made our prayer before the Lord our God, that we might turn from our iniquities and understand your truth. Therefore, the Lord has kept the disaster in mind and brought it upon us. For the Lord our God is righteous in all the works which he does, though we have not obeyed his voice. That's Daniel commenting on the people in Babylon. And of course, there's some history in that of what got them there. But his acknowledgement is we're still not ready to go back because we have sinned. He doesn't say we past tense, as in our forefathers. He acknowledges them, but he's talking about his own generation, that we've not prepared ourselves. Yeah, I prayed to God and made confession and said, Lord, we're not ready. We've sinned and committed iniquity and done wickedness and rebelled. And all those things are true even of the present day for Daniel. And therefore, this great disaster is upon them, and they're not ready for the return. As the psalmist said, they have all turned aside. They have together become corrupt. None of them does good, no, not one. That is descriptive of the generation that led to the captivity and of the people that followed in the time of the captivity for the next generation or two. And so the wording of the psalm is characteristic of the spirit or the attitude which led to captivity. Now, even after they came back, go to the days of Malachi chapter 2 and at verse 17. Malachi 2 and at verse 17, they're back in the land, and we would hope that they're faithfully serving God when they're back there. But listen, this is what it says. You have wearied the Lord with your words, that you say, in what way have we wearied him? In that you say, everyone who does evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delights in them. Or where is the God of justice? They didn't quite say there is no God. But here are the people of God saying, where is the God of justice? Where is God? It doesn't stop there. Malachi 3 and verse 14. It is useless to serve God. What profit is it that we have kept his ordinance and that we have walked as mourners before the Lord of hosts? That's not the pagans talking. That's the people of Judah. The people of Judah said it is useless to serve God. Please tell me, what's the difference between them saying that and the fool saying in his heart there is no God? They're one and the same. It's the same attitude. It's the same actions. And the captivity generations, they turned from God, and that's what led them into captivity. And unfortunately, the generations that came out as well, they turned aside, became corrupt. There is none who are good, no, not one. In fact, that last portion of verse 3, you're going to see that over in Romans. It's quoted in Romans chapter 3 and applied to all of humanity, that there is none who does good, no, not one. Verse 4. Have the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon God? So we might wonder, well, who are these workers of iniquity? And again, it might be convenient to label the Gentile unbelievers, and yes, they are workers of iniquity. Although during the captivity, God was actually using Babylon to accomplish his will. But that's not who the context is talking about. The context is talking about those folks who had turned aside and become corrupt. Verse 3. The context is talking about those who were no longer seeking after God. Verse 2. Those who were acting foolishly and therefore corrupted their ways and doing evil works in verse 1. The context is about those who had left their service to God and turned to wickedness. In Jeremiah chapter 4, Jeremiah is talking about those very people. Jeremiah 4 and at verse 22, and this is before going to the captivity. He says, for my people are foolish, and have not known me. They are silly children. They have no understanding. They are wise to do evil, but to do good they have no knowledge. He's not talking about the atheist. Now, do those things characterize the atheist? Yeah, they do. But that's not who Jeremiah is talking about. Jeremiah is talking about the people of God who have become foolish, who have become fools. Why? Because they have not known me. How do the people of God not know God? Well, they reject his will. They don't walk his way. And they choose their own way. And so in their heart, they have declared that there is no God to them. They have no understanding. They do evil. They have no knowledge of those things that are good. That's the description of Psalm 14 and Psalm 53. He says of these ones that they eat up my people. Have the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread? When the nation turned against the Lord, the whole nation, even the few who were righteous, were put into harm's way. And when Babylon came up against Judah, the righteous were carted away and persecuted just as the wicked were. Jeremiah and Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Ezekiel, and others. And so the actions of the workers of iniquity actually bring judgment to the whole nation, making the whole nation prey and bread to be devoured by the enemies. See, those who do evil, they bring bad things upon everybody. The consistent message of the prophets was to turn to God or call upon God, as the psalmist says here, and they would not. The Lord always calls his people to faithful service. He wants us to turn back if we've turned away. He wants us to seek salvation in him because he has no pleasure in the destruction. He doesn't want us to be destroyed, and yet God is going to be faithful to his will. Verse 5, he says, "Then they are in great fear, for God is with the generation of the righteous." Well, because they wouldn't turn away from their wickedness, they discovered fear. And again, if the psalmist is writing about the Exodus generation, they kept on doing bad things, bad things, bad things. In comes Babylon. Babylon is mighty and fierce, and they're scary. And they carted away a bunch of people and did some destruction. And then some years pass, and Judah kept on doing wickedness. And in comes Babylon again. They came in 3 times before they completely destroyed everything. And so the people in Judah who were turning against God and not doing his will, what they discovered was this great fear. But they weren't willing to remove themselves from the things that brought it upon, which was their wickedness. Now, verse 5 is where the two accounts actually differ. So here in 14 and verse 5, the text is actually intended to give assurance to the righteous. And so they are in great fear, that is, those who are declaring there is no God and walking in wickedness and so forth, for God is with the generation of the righteous. God's still protecting his people. And so the fool rejects God and walks corruptly, but there are some faithful, and we can see what's happening among those faithful. And so as Jeremiah was preaching, eventually his message to the people was, do not fight. When Babylon comes in against you, do not fight. Go. It is God's plan that you go. And go to Babylon and make lives for yourselves in Babylon, marry and have children, and God's going to bring your descendants back. And so those who are righteous would go. And it's much better for you to go as a captive to a foreign land, to stay and fight and die. That was the options that were presented to them. But then as we look at those who were righteous in that foreign land, Daniel chapter 1 through 6 is a narrative of Daniel and his friends And there they were in captivity. And of course, they still faced struggles and difficulties while they were there. But in reading Daniel 1-6, do you get the sense that God was with his people? He sure was, right? Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they would not yield to the Babylonians. They would continue to walk in faith. And they actually rose up in the ranks of their government. And in all of that, they did not yield their religion. They continued in faithful service so much as they could in a foreign land to God. And so God is with the generation of the righteous. He's with his people who will continue to serve him, even in the midst of these trying times. 53 and verse 5 is different. 53 verse 5, and in particular the first portion of verse 5, what we have is there they are in great fear where no fear was, for God has scattered the bones of him who encamps against you. Those who had turned away from the Lord not only experienced the fear and terror of the invasion of the Babylonians, but they would actually fall in judgment before God as well. They invited fear upon fear. Listen to the words of Ezekiel. Now, Ezekiel was a contemporary prophet of the time of the Babylonian invasion and captivity. Ezekiel chapter 6 and at verse 5, I will lay the corpses of the children of Israel before their idols, and I will scatter your bones all around your altars. In all your dwelling places, the cities shall be laid waste, and the high places shall be desolate. The slain shall fall in your midst, and you shall know that I am the Lord. God has scattered their bones. Again, that's what Ezekiel said God would do to the wicked of his people, the corpses of the children of Israel and those who were serving before their idols. He would scatter their bones all around. He would bring down their high places. He would destroy their city. But then that same prophet, verse 8 through 10, still in chapter 6 of Ezekiel, he speaks of the remnant that would remain. He speaks of the righteous that 14 and verse 5 is talking about, that God is with the generation of the righteous, that God is with his people. Now, in 53 verse 5, the phrase of him who encamps against you, that sounds like it should be about the Babylonians, that mighty force that came in and destroyed God's people and destroyed the land and destroyed the temple. But let me remind you that the Babylonians at that time were actually doing the will of God. As odd as that seems, God was using Babylon to accomplish his will against his own people who had turned against him, who had become unrighteous. So truly those who encamped against his people were the wicked of their own nation. They're the ones who brought the destruction upon them. Had they turned back to God, God would have never needed to use Babylon. And so they were the ones who encamped against their own people, who turned away from God and brought the destruction their way, who did these abominable deeds, and therefore God brought upon them judgment. But the same God who comforts the faithful in the midst of trials and troubles, 14 verse 5, is the one who brings judgment and condemnation against the wicked in those same trials, 53 and verse 5. And so we serve a God who he sees us as individuals and treats us in that manner and judges us in that way. All right, verse 6, at least verse 6 of chapter 14. Verse 6, you shame the counsel of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. So the fool, those who don't obey God and have turned from his way to their own way, they shame the poor, it says here. Now, the word poor, that is a valid translation of the Hebrew word, but let me give you a few other words that Strong's provides. those who are depressed or afflicted or humble or lowly or needy. The wicked among the people shame those who had a mind to serve God. It's not just simply they went out and found poor people and started oppressing poor people. This is those who had a mind to serve God and therefore were afflicted and humbled by their own brethren because they chose to do that. That happens all the time, right? Those who want to serve God end up being the butt of jokes and mistreated by those who count themselves to be loftier than that. In the latter half of the text, again, there's a distinction between 14 and 53. In 14, the oppression of the righteous is looked upon by God, and his care for them is acknowledged. The Lord is his refuge. God's going to take care of these poor ones, these humbled ones, these ones who are being mistreated, despite how their brethren are treating them. Psalm 9, verse 9, the Lord also will be the refuge of the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble. But over in 53, Psalm 53, verse 5, the latter half of the psalm, the imagery is very different. There it says, you have put them to shame because God has despised them. You have put them to shame because God has despised them. The ones who are put to shame in this rendition of the psalm are despised by God. It's not the same ones who are being put to shame in Psalm 14. Here, it's not about the righteous, but about the wicked, the oppressors. The oppressors who are putting to shame God's people, God will put them to shame, is what 53 is telling us. Because they've not only rejected God, but they've mistreated the people of God. All right, let's close the psalm out. So Psalm 14, verse 7, or 53 and verse 6. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord brings back the captivity of his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. So the psalmist anticipates the salvation of his people. Salvation, he says, would come out of Zion. Now, Zion, of course, is a reference to Jerusalem. In particular, the mountain upon which Jerusalem would be built was identified as Mount Zion. And so Jerusalem, or Zion, was the hub of Jewish worship. It was from the time that God laid his name there, and therefore the temple would be established there. And then after the captivity, where would they come back to? They'd come back to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the hub of Jewish worship. And so their focus is on Zion, on Jerusalem, even while they're in captivity. In Daniel chapter 6 and at verse 10, have you ever noted that Daniel, when he's in his upper room and he opens up his window to pray, he opens his window to face Jerusalem? Why is he doing that? I would think that it might be a whole lot better, Daniel, given the decree that had been signed, keep your window shut, go ahead and pray in your closet, right? But no, Daniel opens his window toward Jerusalem and he prays. Here's why he does that. 1 Kings chapter 8 and at verse 44, this is at the dedication of the temple by Solomon. When your people go out to battle against their enemy, wherever you send them, when they pray to the Lord toward the city which you have chosen and the temple which you have built for your name, then hear in heaven their prayer and their supplication and maintain their cause. When they sin against you, for there's none who does not sin, and you become angry with them and deliver them to the enemy, and they take them captive to the land of the enemy, far or near, yet when they come to themselves in the land where they have been carried away, and repent and make supplication to you in the land of those who took them captive, saying, we have sinned and done wrong, we have committed wickedness, and when they return to you with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies who led them away captive, and pray to you toward their land which you gave to their fathers, and to the city which you have chosen, and the temple which you have built for your name, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, their prayer and their supplication, and maintain their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you, and all their transgressions which they have transgressed against you, and grant them compassion before those who took them captive, that they may have compassion on them, that your eyes may be open to the supplication of your servants and to the supplication of your people, to listen to them whenever they call to you. Daniel was doing what Solomon said he ought to do. He's off in a foreign land, captive, and he faces Jerusalem with his window open in full assurance and faith that God is going to bring them back. That is the promise of God. And so after the 70 years of captivity were done, Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah would lead 3 different phases of the people back to the land of Judah, back to Jerusalem. The psalmist here says, when the Lord brings back the captivity of his people. The same terminology is in Psalm 126 and verse 1. It is a psalm of ascent. The psalms of ascent were after the captivity. These were written, and they would sing these as they approached Jerusalem for the various feasts that they would go to Jerusalem for. And in Psalm 126 and at verse 1, it's worded in the past tense, when the Lord brought back the captivity of Zion. And he's not talking about bringing them back into captivity. It's bringing the captives back. That's the meaning of it. When he brought back the captivity, when he brought us out of captivity, then they were able to come and worship. That's Psalm 126, past tense. Notice here, it's worded in the future tense. When the Lord brings back the captivity of his people. When he finally releases us from Babylon and we get to go back home. This psalm was written while in Babylon by a people, at least some, and the psalmist certainly, who wanted to serve God faithful and yet saw the wickedness of their brethren around them. That's part of the reason why they were there in the first place, right? But he wanted to see their release. He wanted to see the captivity of Babylon returned back home. He says, when that happens, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. Let God's people rejoice when the Lord has brought them out. Now, salvation for Israel coming out of Zion. For the Jews, that's all focused upon Jerusalem, upon them returning to the temple and rebuilding the temple and those kinds of things. We might look at that a little bit different because that's where Christ came from. Our salvation came out of Zion. Our salvation came out of Jerusalem. And Acts chapter 2, we've got the gospel being proclaimed first at Jerusalem and then going out to the ends of the earth. But salvation is always linked back to Zion, to the place where God had put his name. Well, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. That is something that an atheist will say. But understand that he's not just talking about atheists here. We can be foolish just simply by not doing the will of God. We can take the place of the fool. And in fact, God referred to his own people as foolish on multiple occasions because in their hearts, they acted as though there was no God. Let's not act that way. Let's glorify God, acknowledge his existence, acknowledge his might, acknowledge his rule, and let's be sure that we follow his way rather than our way. Our way leads to destruction, plain and simple. His way leads to life and life eternal. And so let's turn to God and walk his way and glorify him, and he will have us with him in eternity in the end. If we can help you in some way, let us know as we stand together and as we sing.